This is the story of Matthew Carter and his wife Sophie Carter. They married young enough to believe that love was mostly a matter of showing up, and for a long time, that was almost true. Matthew was the kind of man who expressed himself through presence, through the quiet maintenance of a shared life, through small and unremarkable acts of devotion that he never thought to name. Sophie was the kind of woman who needed more than presence, though she could never quite articulate what that more looked like, and so the need curdled quietly inside her into something closer to contempt. What eroded between them was not traumatic in any visible way. It happened the way light leaves a room in winter, gradually, then completely, and only noticed once the cold has already settled in. This is a story about emotional blindness on both sides, about the slow violence of being made to feel invisible by someone who shares your bed, and about what happens when a person finally stops asking to be seen. The house on Ellsworth Drive had the particular tidiness of a home where two people had stopped arguing about small things. The throw pillows were always straight. The dishwasher was always emptied. Matthew had learned, over 4 years of marriage, which silences meant Sophie was tired and which ones meant something else entirely, and he had learned, more importantly, not to push against the second kind. They had a routine that functioned like a well-maintained appliance, reliable, efficient, devoid of warmth. Dinner at 7, television until 9:30, Sophie to bed with her book, Matthew with his laptop at the kitchen table, ostensibly working but mostly just existing in the quiet of a house that felt, on certain nights, like it was holding its breath. He was 31. He still thought sometimes that things could shift. The physical withdrawal had started gradually, the way most erosions do, not a decision, but an accumulation of small retreats, a turned shoulder, a taunt tonight that carried no apology and no rain check. Weeks that turned into longer stretches of nothing, during which Matthew had tried, with diminishing confidence, to close the distance. A hand on her back while she washed dishes, sitting close enough on the couch that their arms touched. Once, memorably, bringing her coffee in bed on a Saturday morning, standing there with the mug outstretched while she looked at her phone, and being thanked in the same tone one might thank a hotel concierge. He had stopped bringing coffee to bed after that. He had stopped quite a few things. What made it difficult, what made it confusing in a way that he couldn't fully organize into language, was that Sophie didn't seem unhappy. She laughed at things. She made plans with her friends. She redecorated the guest bathroom in a shade of green she'd been considering for months, and she seemed genuinely pleased with the result. She was not a woman who was suffering. She simply was not particularly interested in him. Matthew had told himself many things about this, that she was stressed from work, that this was a phase, the kind that long-term couples move through, that he was perhaps expecting too much, or the wrong things, or in the wrong way. He had bent his interpretation of the situation into so many shapes, trying to find one that didn't hurt, that he had become, without fully realizing it, a man who had stopped trusting his own perception of reality. Emily Dawson came into his life sideways, the way meaningful things often do. She was a colleague, not close, not someone he lunched with, who had been assigned to the same quarterly project review. They'd been working in adjacent corners of a shared conference room for 3 weeks before they'd had a real conversation, and even then it had been about spreadsheet formatting. She was unpretentious in a way that Matthew found disarming. She ate lunch at her desk and remembered small things people told her and laughed freely, without self-consciousness. She did not perform. He noticed this about her the way you notice a particular quality of light, not dramatically, just as something true. One Thursday evening they had both stayed late, and she had looked up from her monitor and said, without preamble, "You look like someone who hasn't had a proper meal since Tuesday." She'd offered him half her leftover pasta from the office refrigerator, and they'd eaten at the conference table, talking about nothing in particular. The project, a podcast she'd been listening to, whether the office's new coffee machine was actually an improvement or just louder. Matthew drove home feeling, for reasons he couldn't articulate, slightly more solid than he had in months. Sophie was already in bed when he got in. Her lamp was off. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment, just a moment, watching the shape of her under the duvet, and felt something he didn't have a name for yet. He went back to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of tea he didn't finish. Outside, the neighborhood was completely dark, and the house was very quiet, and in that quiet Matthew Carter sat at his own kitchen table and understood, for the first time, that he was lonely, not alone. Lonely. The distinction felt important. By the time autumn came, Matthew had developed a new morning routine. He woke at 5:45 and ran, not because he had any particular fitness ambition, but because the hour before Sophie's alarm gave him 50 minutes that belonged entirely to himself, and he had begun to need that more than sleep. He ran the same 2-mile loop through the neighborhood, past the elementary school and the park with the broken fountain. And when he returned, he would stand in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light and feel something close to peace. He had lost weight without intending to. His shoulders had squared. A man at the hardware store had asked him, completely unprompted, if he played college football, and Matthew had laughed in a way that surprised him, genuinely, without reservation. Sophie noticed the changes with an expression that Matthew could not quite read. Not jealousy, not appreciation, something more like the mild alertness of someone who has recognized that a room's furniture has been rearranged and is not yet sure whether they mind. "You're up early again," she said one morning, finding him at the counter with his coffee and a book, hair still damp from his shower. "Couldn't sleep," he said, which had been true initially and was now simply the answer he gave. She poured her coffee. She looked at him with the particular attentiveness she reserved for things that confused her. "Are you okay?" The question surprised him, not because she asked it, but because of how long it had been since she had. He considered several answers. He said, "Yeah, I'm good." She seemed to accept this. She took her coffee upstairs. At work, he and Emily had graduated, naturally, without discussion, from conference room acquaintances to something more consistent. They took lunch together 2 or 3 times a week, usually at the sandwich place on the corner that neither of them loved, but both found reliably adequate. They talk the way people do when they've discovered that the other person actually listens. Carefully at first, then with increasing ease. She told him about her divorce 2 years earlier, not bitterly, not as a wound she was still probing, but as information she was comfortable enough to share. She had wanted children. Her ex-husband had changed his mind after the wedding and never found a way to say it directly, and so 2 years had passed in the way Matthew's own years had, in a kind of suspension until she'd finally understood that silence was its own answer. Matthew listened to this and felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. I figured it out eventually." She looked at him with a directness that he'd come to recognize as simply the way she was. Some people figure things out. Some people don't. He stirred his coffee for a moment. "Which do you think you are now?" "Working on it," she said, and smiled in a way that wasn't a deflection. He thought about Sophie that evening, watching her move around the kitchen, efficient and self-contained, the invisible radius around her that he'd learned not to enter, and tried to remember the last time he'd felt that ease with her. The last time a conversation had moved forward rather than circling carefully around the thing neither of them was saying. It was Sophie who broke the silence, which was unusual. She had set her fork down with a particular deliberateness that Matthew had learned to notice. "My mother asked if we were doing anything for the holidays," she said. "What did you tell her?" "I said I didn't know yet." A pause. The refrigerator hummed. Matthew. The way she said his name had the quality of something she'd been rehearsing. "Do you feel like we've been distant?" He looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Something careful in it, something that might have been an attempt at openness. A week earlier, a month earlier, a year earlier, he would have felt the swell of relief at this opening and rushed toward it. He would have said yes, immediately yes, and offered everything he had. He felt it now, that reflex, and watched it rise in him and pass. "A little," he said. She nodded slowly, like a person confirming something they'd suspected. "I think maybe we should talk about it." "Okay. Not tonight, I'm tired. But soon." "Sure," he said. She picked her fork back up. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed. Matthew looked at his plate and noticed, with a quiet that was neither cold nor warm, but simply accurate, that he was waiting for the conversation to be over. "I don't know," he said at a certain pause. Not quite to Sophie, not quite to himself, his eyes going briefly to some middle distance that wasn't the kitchen. Maybe like, tell someone this story, or, I don't know, subscribe or something. Sophie looked up from her plate. What? He blinked, refocused. Nothing. Sorry, never mind. She held his gaze for a beat, then looked back down. He ate the rest of his dinner in silence and found that the silence, now, was entirely his own. The conversation Sophie had promised happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks later, when the light in the living room had the flat quality of an overcast November, and neither of them had anywhere they needed to be. Matthew had known it was coming. He'd watched it taking shape in her behavior, a slight softening, a new attention to whether he'd eaten or how he'd slept, and had understood it for what it was. Sophie in the early stages of deciding that something needed to change. She sat across from him with her knees drawn up, a mug held in both hands. He was in the armchair. The coffee table stretched between them like a formal distance. I think I've been checked out, she said. He waited, for a while. I've been aware of it, and I kept thinking it would resolve itself, or that it was just me being tired, or stressed about work, or something temporary. She studied the rim of her mug, but I don't think it was any of those things. What do you think it was? She took a moment with that. He appreciated that she took a moment with it rather than reaching for the first available explanation. I think I got comfortable in a way that wasn't actually comfort. I think I stopped trying because it felt safer to stop trying. She looked up at him. I stopped being a partner to you. He considered this. He considered what she was offering him, the admission, the opening, the implicit question within it. You did, he said. I know, for a long time. I know. Her voice didn't buckle. He respected that. Sophie had always had a kind of structural integrity even in difficult moments. She didn't dissolve, didn't deflect into tears. I'm not asking you to pretend it wasn't. I want you to know that I see it now. Matthew looked at the window. The light outside was the color of old paper. Can I ask you something honestly? Yes, she said. Do you know what it was like the last few years? She held his gaze. Tell me. So he did. Not loudly, not with the compressed force of years of accumulated grievance suddenly released, but carefully, specifically. He told her about the coffee he'd brought her in bed, about the evenings he'd reached for her and found her already turned away, about the particular quality of rejection that isn't cruel and isn't intentional, but is somehow more persistent for being so ordinary, the way it becomes, after enough repetition, a fact about yourself rather than a fact about a situation. He told her that he had spent 2 years trying to find the correct version of himself that she would want, and that in the process of all that trying, he had lost track of who he actually was. She listened. Her expression moved, not dramatically, not in the telegraphed way of a person performing remorse, but in small increments, the way a face moves when something is actually landing. I didn't think of it as rejection, she said when he stopped. I didn't think of it as something I was doing to you. I thought I was just existing, being in my own space. She paused. That's a terrible thing to realize about yourself. It is, he agreed. I'm sorry, Matthew. He heard the apology. He received it. He set it down somewhere inside himself with a kind of care, and then he sat for a moment looking at his wife. This woman he had chosen, who had been good in many ways and absent in others, who was now offering him the honesty he'd wanted for years, and he waited to feel something shift. It didn't. That frightened him more than the years of rejection had. He had expected that this conversation, if it ever came, would feel like a door opening. Instead, it felt like standing in a hallway and understanding that the room you'd been locked out of had, in the intervening time, become somewhere you no longer needed to go. I appreciate you saying all of this, he said, but, he shook his head. No but. I appreciate it. She searched his face for something she didn't find. What happens now? She asked. "I don't know," he said with an honesty that he couldn't fully protect her from. "I think I need some time." She nodded. She uncurled her legs from beneath her and set her mug on the table with a careful, final sound. "Okay," she said. She left the room. Matthew stayed in the armchair. The flat November light held. 6 months later, Sophie redecorated the study. She had done it systematically over a weekend while Matthew was staying at his brother's. New shelves, different curtains, a chair she'd found at a vintage market in a shade of mustard yellow. She'd been drawn to without quite understanding why. When she was done, she stood in the doorway looking at the result and felt something she interpreted as progress. She had told the story of their separation to various people in various ways. To her closest friend Renata, she had been relatively honest. "I wasn't present enough, and by the time I understood that, I think it was too late." To her mother, she had offered something vaguer about growing apart, the kind of narrative that contained enough truth to function as a complete explanation. To herself, in the odd hours between sleep and waking, she sometimes came closer to the full version, that she had been selfish in a way she hadn't recognized as selfishness, because it had looked from the inside like self-preservation, and that by the time she'd understood the difference, Matthew had already undergone some private recalibration she hadn't been invited to witness. She did not hate herself for it. That would have been easier in a way. Instead, she carried it as a kind of permanent minor weather, not storm, not sun, but a persistent gray that she'd learned to function inside. Matthew had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in the Ridgewood neighborhood, on a street with large trees and a coffee shop on the corner where he'd become a regular. He had continued running. He had bought better furniture than he'd expected to, a proper sofa, a lamp with good light, a kitchen table where he ate meals that he'd learned to cook with more intention than he'd had when cooking had felt like a performance of domesticity. He was, on balance, more at peace than he had been in years. And this peace coexisted with grief in a way he was learning to accept. He and Emily had continued their friendship through the separation and after, with a naturalness that never felt rushed. They had not titled it, had not pushed it toward any particular shape. They ran together on Saturday mornings sometimes. They cooked dinner at her apartment on occasional Fridays, talking long past when they should have said goodnight. She had met his brother once at a casual birthday gathering, and his brother had pulled Matthew aside later and said, with characteristic simplicity, "She's good, man." Matthew had nodded. He knew. What had developed between them was not a romance constructed from the wreckage of his marriage. It was something that had grown in the space that his marriage had failed to fill, tended by two people who had both spent time in the particular solitude of being lonely inside a relationship, and had come out of it knowing more precisely what they needed. It was easy. That was the thing that surprised him most. After years of managing and measuring and carefully calibrating his own wants to survive Sophie's emotional temperature, something easy felt almost suspect. He kept waiting to discover the hidden catch. He was beginning to believe there wasn't one. Sophie called him on a Tuesday evening in April. He was washing dishes when his phone screen lit up with her name, and he stood for a moment with soap still on his hands. "Hi," she said when he answered. "Hey." A brief silence. This isn't anything serious. I just wanted to see how you were." "I'm good. You?" "I'm okay." A pause. "Actually, I'm okay. Some days more than others." He could hear her choice to be honest. "The houses. It's a lot of space for one person. I didn't notice that when you were here." He didn't answer that directly. There wasn't a direction he wanted to take it. "How's work?" he asked. They talked for 11 minutes, in the pleasant, slightly formal way of people who have deep history and a new arrangement to navigate. Before she hung up, she said, with a carefulness that he recognized as the residue of courage, "I'm glad you're good, Matthew." "You too, Soph." After he hung up, he stood at the sink, finishing the dishes, and he recognized the sensation inside him as something like tenderness, genuine tenderness, for her, for the marriage, for all of it. And it coexisted with the certainty, the quiet, unassailable certainty, that it was over. He dried his hands. Through the window he could see the street, the lit windows of other apartments, other lives. He texted Emily, Dinner Friday. Still good? Her reply came in less than a minute, obviously. I'm trying that new pasta recipe. Prepare yourself. He smiled. He put his phone down. The apartment was quiet, and the quiet was entirely comfortable, and Matthew Carter stood in his own kitchen at 32 years old and understood that he had, without quite knowing when it had happened, become someone who was no longer waiting. Sophie drove past his building once in early June without planning to. She had been on her way back from a meeting on the other side of the city, and the route had taken her down his street, and she'd had a single, unguarded moment of wanting to see it. The place where he built the life that came after her. It was an unremarkable building, red brick, with the large trees she'd heard him mention. There was a coffee shop on the corner, exactly as he'd described, with little tables out front in the early summer warmth. She didn't stop. She drove past and continued home. She had asked him 2 weeks earlier if he'd want to meet for coffee. She had framed it as a practical matter. There was still some paperwork to finalize. A shared account she'd been meaning to address. He'd agreed, with the warmth and absence of drama that characterized him now, and they'd met at a place near her office on a Wednesday morning. He looked well, genuinely plainly well, not in a pointed way. Not in the way of someone who has remade themselves specifically to be seen as changed, but in the way of someone who has been sleeping enough and eating enough and spending their time in ways that are fundamentally nourishing. He was present. He had always, she thought, been present. The difference was that the quality of his presence had changed, had lost the anxious vigilance of a person managing their own invisibility. They had handled the account in 15 minutes. They talked for 45 more. He mentioned Emily without calculation. Her name came up naturally, part of a larger sentence about plans for the summer, and Sophie heard it land in her chest like something dropped from a height. Not with jealousy exactly, with recognition. She'd known in some abstract way that he had someone in his life now. Mutual connections had supplied fragments of information she hadn't sought out but hadn't refused. Hearing the name said easily in that voice, in that tone, that was different. She sounds like a good person, Sophie said. She is, Matthew said. The absence of elaboration was its own thing. She looked at him across the table, at this man she had married, who had tried for years to be enough for her in whatever form she needed, who had loved her in the quiet, undemonstrative way she'd once found insufficient. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, what she had done. Not that she had rejected him though she had, not that she'd been absent though she had been. What she understood, sitting across from him in a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning, watching him exist in the easy way of someone who is no longer asking to be accepted. What she understood was that she had been given something real and had held it carelessly, and that by the time she'd understood its value, it had already found somewhere else to be. She had not lost him to someone else. She had lost him to the version of himself she'd never quite let exist while they were together. I'm glad you're happy, she said. Matthew looked at her. There was nothing complicated in his face. No triumph, no residual wound, no effort of any kind. He was simply, evidently fine. I think you'll be okay too, he said. In time. It was the gentlest thing he could have said. She recognized that. It was also, in its gentleness, the truest possible confirmation of where they both stood. That his care for her had survived in the form of goodwill, and that goodwill was what it was, and nothing more. They walked out together. On the sidewalk, he hugged her briefly, with the warmth of someone saying goodbye to someone they once knew very well, and still wished well. And then he walked toward the parking lot, and she stood on the pavement watching him go. He didn't look back, not unkindly, just didn't. Sophie stood there in the June light for a moment longer than she needed to. Around her the street continued, indifferent, a man walking his dog, 2 women sharing something on a phone, a delivery cyclist navigating the corner, the ordinary, relentless business of everyone else's life. She had thought for a while that the ending of a marriage was the event, the paperwork, the apartment, the conversation, but it wasn't. It was this, standing on a pavement in ordinary light, watching the back of someone you let yourself stop seeing, and knowing, without drama, without the relief of rage or the clarity of blame, that the thing you'd taken for granted had been, all along, the thing. She put on her sunglasses. She walked to her car. The city didn't pause. The light changed. Traffic moved. Sophie Carter drove home alone and arrived there before she was ready, and the house was very quiet, and this time the quiet was entirely hers.